And now, live from the Star City, your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Hello, beautiful lights, and welcome to the Just Bernard Show. I'm Reverend Medium Tracey Lockwood. I'm host of From a Medium's Perspective here on Revolution Radio. My hour follows Bernard's. And Bernard has asked me to take over his show today because he's undergoing another surgery relative to his burst appendix. So send him your love and light and find him on Facebook. Send him some encouraging greetings. He'd love to hear from you. And he sends his well wishes, greetings, and love to you. For those of you that don't know me, my show follows Bernard's show. I got on Revolution Radio because of an interview that I did on his show talking about your psychic gifts. And I think it has close to 20,000 hits on YouTube now, which is pretty awesome. Thank you, Bernard. So a few of you might be wondering, did she actually say Reverend Medium Tracey Lockwood? And yes, I did. And that might seem like an incredibly bizarre combination of titles. I kind of realized that that's not the thing you hear quite every day. I am the executive minister for an organization called the Universal Mind. It's a 501c3 public charity, and it's a spiritual but not religious organization. And I'm also a private psychic tutor, and I teach people one-on-one, and I also offer workshops on occasion. And I operate pretty much solely as a professional medium. That is my job. And if you'd like to check me out during the show, you can find more on my website at mediumtraceylockwood.com. So I was thinking, okay, what do I talk about on his show without him there to interview me and to ask those amazing, insightful questions that he asks? And I thought, well, probably because I have such an unusual title, maybe it would be cool to talk about the fact that you are psychic too. And there seems to be a lot of hubbub and consternation about what it means to be psychic. I think it all boils down to nomenclature, the words that we use regarding the particular aspects that are related to psychism. You know, being psychic refers to the ability to sense things beyond the range of ordinary perception. Or at least that's how it's made out to be. And sometimes it's referred to as extrasensory perception. And I'm often asked, like, what's the difference between a psychic and a medium? And I would say that mediumship is just a little further down a spectrum of intuition. Kind of goes from intuition to psychism to mediumship. If you want to think about it this way, each of us is born with instinct. We have a basic instinct. It's sort of a fight or flight thing, that survivalistic part of us that seeks food, clothing, shelter, heat, coolness, sex, all the basics. But most of us are aware that we have something that goes beyond our instinct, and we call that intuition. Intuition is the things that we just know. We get that gut reaction maybe about the truth behind the words of someone, the true emotion that's underlying a person's insistence that they're okay and they're not, or that something's just not right and we need to take a different course of action. That's intuition. And intuition merges into psychic ability at the point that you ask yourself, how did I know that? How did I know that so-and-so was going to pass? How did I know that so-and-so was on the phone? How did I know that I should turn left instead of right on that day and found out later that an accident had been avoided, or that you ran across somebody, not over somebody, hopefully, but across somebody that, you wouldn't have met otherwise? Mediumship is just a little bit further along that spectrum of intuition. It's the point that we can answer that question of how did we know? Mediumship is when we can identify, classify, describe the source of that information, whether it's an angel, deceased loved one, or some other being. And then being able to communicate those messages that that person, angel or being, when we do that, it's called channeling. And it's really nothing new. Mystics from the beginning of time have been particularly gifted in this arena, and I think some cultures were more sensitized than others over the course of time, too, where it was maybe natural to look at people's auras and diagnose their physical ailments or communicate with those that had passed. It was much more common in some other cultures. And mediums are sometimes revered and sometimes judged pretty harshly and rejected for their gifts. And although many of our listeners might not be Christian, Christianity remains the predominant religion in America, and there's a great deal of confusion relative to psychic ability, that comes from that particular perspective. And I think much of it's based on an Old Testament view of a prophetess or psychic named the Witch of Endor. And I might mention here that all psychics are not witches, because witches practice a religion that is earth-based. Some of them are Wiccan, some of them are pagan, some of them are solitary. I'm none of the above. I don't have any negative view of that at all, but just to clarify. And King Saul was obviously a king, and he sought the abilities of this psychic when he was under a lot of strain in his personal life and his military life, and he didn't like what she told him. And so he issued a mandate that no one ever seek out the counsel of a psychic. However, he violated his own mandate and returned to her because of the accuracy of the information she had given him. He was later killed, and that was actually the prophecy that he didn't like that she had given him. So it did play out that way. Hopefully, I will never have to give anyone a dark and shady prophecy. In fact, that's one of the things that I refuse to do is deal with death dates of either my clients or their loved ones. I just think that's creepy and won't do it. But anyway, there are a lot of things that are also prohibited in the Old Testament that people don't adhere to today because they consider it a different dispensation. For instance, shrimp is prohibited, but I would guess that most of our listeners enjoy a plate of shrimp now and again and don't think that they're going to go to hell for it. So in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians, in the new dispensation, there's a talk about the gifts of the Spirit, and this is from the Bible, and that may or may not be the book of our listeners at large, but it talks about the gifts of our spirit, and it refers to a word of knowledge. And a word of knowledge is our intuition. That's that part of us that just knows. And it's the first step that takes us beyond our survivalistic instinct. And it takes us into the continuum of awareness and intuition. And it also mentions in that same passage in 1 Corinthians a word of wisdom. And wisdom is something that you say that sounds really smart and quite true. And that's that part of you that doesn't know how you knew that. And a word of wisdom is psychic ability. Another gift that's mentioned is the discerning of spirits, and that's mediumship, being able to classify, identify, and describe spirits. And it doesn't stop there. It talks about the tongues and interpretation of tongues, and that's simply channeling. Tongues is channeling the messages of beings in their native tongue. It says in the tongues of men and angels, and those messages are spoken in the language of the original speaker. Interpretation of tongues is channeling, getting tongue-tied. The interpretation of tongues is channeling those messages in the language of the listener. And Jesus himself said, desire the best gifts. And these so-called gifts of the Spirit are not Christian gifts, but they're human gifts, and they're natural to us as breathing. And as I said, they've existed since the dawn of time. They're really nothing new. That's just the text that is most familiar to us here in the East. So, why do some of us feel so distant from these abilities, and why do they, why do we view them so differently? And I think it's again down to the nomenclature. When we are born, we are each born with all our spiritual faculties in place. We're able to see, hear, feel, and know at a clairvoyant, clairaudient, clairsentient, claircognitant level, as well as our physical level, if our bodies are blessed with those gifts, the physical gifts of sight and hearing and etc., thinking. And I don't know if you're aware, but there have been some stories in the media lately that have been about children that are born with a retention of their memory as to who they were in a past life. But actually, all of us have lived before and we will live again. Reincarnation is a concept somewhat alien to many of people in the East, but not at all new to the majority of the Earth's population. Madame Blavatsky in the late 1800s brought Eastern philosophy to the West, and reincarnation is the idea that our soul seeks experience and expansion, that it grows through contact with the physical dimension, aka planet Earth. And I'd like to propose that we also have growth whether or not we are in physical body, because there are spiritual truths and there are physical truths that go beyond gravity and all those things. So before we come into this earth, we are spiritual beings. And just because we came into the earth plane doesn't remove the fact that we're spiritual beings. And as spiritual beings, we have perceptions and a connection to that other realm as part of our identity and makeup. So it's all very good and well, you might say. You might say, well, Tracey, I still don't know what you're talking about, and you might think, that you're not psychic, that that's something, a label that's reserved for the others, people like me who are strange or unusual, ethical or not. And of course, as a professional, I practice ethics as a part of what goes on. But for those outside the profession, perhaps they wouldn't understand that. So I thought today that it might be interesting to share some of my memories of growing up as a medium, not to be all about me, but to link for you in your mind some of the experiences that you might not have labeled psychic or mediumship. I want to go in a brief thing and say that clairvoyant is clear seeing, and it is when you see something in a vibrational plane that isn't evident to the other people around. Clairaudient is when you can hear the words of people in the other realm or sights and sounds beyond the natural perspective. And we'll maybe use some other words there too. Empathic, for those of you that are not familiar with that, means that you can pick up on the emotions of the people around you and read them. And many of you that are listening are empathic because you have that ability to feel what other people feel. Much better than being sociopathic in my book. And I'd like to differentiate empathy from telepathy. Mind-to-mind communication is something that occurs between all of us, but particularly when someone's communicating with someone on the other side. But the real story comes through empathy, the whole emotional story, because empathy is the language of the etheric realm, and words are the language of the physical realm. And the reason that we use words is because no one seems to understand us when we telepathically ask them to please change our diaper that we're wet. And so we're just broadcasting that thought, in our mind. Could you change my diaper? It's wet. And nobody listens usually, unless the parent is very sensitive. And so the baby gets a little more insistent, and then that doesn't get heard, and they blast it, and that doesn't get heard. And so they start to cry out of frustration. And we eventually learn to vocalize our needs, and we learn to speak for what we want. And after a while, after people ignore our gifts, after people reject our efforts to show them compassion or healing, after we, are not heard telepathically, we kind of forget sometimes that we have these abilities. And usually the only one that remains for most of us is unconditional love, which can get us in a lot of trouble if we don't balance it with discernment and with some of the other gifts. So anyway, so I didn't consider myself a medium either until the title was applied to me. And you might wonder how that was done. I was studying at the Arthur Findlay College of Psychic Science in Stansted, England in 2010. And I just had never thought, as I brought through the mother of one of my instructors and channeled and did trance healing and all the stuff that you get to work on when you're up there, that I didn't even know that I could do some of it until it was something we tried. I didn't really label myself a medium until they said, well, will the next medium take the platform? And I was thinking it was one of the others, and I realized they were talking about me, and it suddenly struck me, oh my God, I'm a medium, and it was so wild because I just had never put that label on. And so I just hadn't associated the natural experiences that I was having with being a psychic or medium. And I'm going to guess the same is true. So I want to share some memories. The first memory that I had was actually early, and it was in my crib, and it was a very mediumistic memory. I was actually seeing the faces of people that were my ancestors and guides sort of coming through the ethers. The way I remember it, they were like little tadpole faces, and they were coming through sort of over my head. I couldn't really see the rest of them. It was sort of like a disturbance in the air, sort of like you would see maybe a disturbance in water or something, and just the faces of them would come through. And I was quite comfortable with them. I remember kind of looking at them, and they were kind of looking at me. And so that was my first memory. My second memory was an empathic memory, and it was one of claircognizance, which is clear knowing. And I was drawing on the floor, and I was probably about 2.5, I'm going to guess, big enough to sit up on the floor, but hands clumsy enough. I might even have been as young as 18 months. I don't know. I don't recall the actual age, but I do remember holding an orange crayon. And we had those 1950s floorboards that I still have in the house I live in, that are that kind of orangish, sort of golden red color. And I was just really noticing how, as my little hand awkwardly drew on the floor, how subtle the contrast was between orange and the color of the floorboards. And all of a sudden, I had this knowledge that came to me that was, Mom will be upset and it will hurt her that I did this. And it wasn't because someone had told me don't draw on the floor. And it wasn't that I was trying to be bad or angry drawing on the floor. I was actually quite happy drawing on the floor. But I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that that would upset her, and I stopped immediately. And so that was empathy, and also claircognizance, like just knowing, clear knowing, and feeling the emotional impact of what was going on potentially for my mom. The next memory that I have, I had moved. I was moving from Connecticut to Virginia, and I was standing up in the back seat of the car. I was born in 1959, so this was about 1964, 3, somewhere in there zone. And we were driving, we were getting ready to leave Connecticut, and I was standing looking out the back window of my car. My friends at the time had given me coloring books and crayons, which my mom, as an art teacher, would have disapproved of because she likes original things and not filling in the lines. But there are purposes to everything. And I looked out the back window, and no one had explained to me. I guess they wouldn't have thought to explain to a 3-year-old that, or 4-year-old that we're not coming back. But they didn't. And I just knew that I had this very strong feeling, knowing I will never see my friends again. And that's also like claircognizance. It's sort of a fancy word for just knowing, that intuitive gut awareness there. The next one was the first time that I ever had a clairaudient experience. And that was when I had lost my tricycle. I was about 4 at this time, very close to that other memory in time. And we had moved to Farmville, Virginia, and I had lost my tricycle. And I was looking for it. I was trying to find it, and I couldn't. And I was beginning to get very upset. And I heard the words very clearly in my mind, "It's over there." And I looked over there, and there it was. And that was the memory that kind of spurred my interest in finding, in later years, as I, was taken to church on a daily basis and stuff. It kind of spurred an interest in learning, where does that fit in with religion? And the long road that I trekked in exploring different religious philosophies ended in a short answer, which it isn't in religion, it's in our nature, it's in our spiritual ability as people, So the next memory I had was of being in nursery school, and I had joined a class, and it was in someone's house, and we had this music room where everybody would sit in a circle and play music. And I just couldn't understand it at all because I hadn't really been very socialized. I had spent my early childhood playing with cats and dogs and outside and talking to fairies and things like that. And I really didn't get why everybody was banging things, because I guess they weren't very coordinated or good, and it just upset me because I didn't like it. But that wasn't the part. It was in the playground. The first week that I was there, there was a young boy, obviously, because we were in nursery school, at the top of a slide, and there was a little girl in front of him, and she was scared to go down. She was scared to go down that slide, but he pushed her. He just pushed her. And of course, she went down too quickly. It was very upsetting. And I was so startled. I thought, how can he not know that she was scared? And that's an empathic ability, when you can see beyond the story in front of your eyes, where you can see the truth of the story beyond your eyes. And he had just pushed her down the slide because he was frustrated. He wanted to go, and she was in his way. But he didn't have any sensitivity at all toward her physical, her emotional state there. So I think in the next half of the show, we're going to be talking about some more experiences that I've had that hopefully will link for you some of the intuitive and psychic and possibly mediumship experiences that you might have had. If you're curious about finding me, my website is mediumtracylockwood.com. And on YouTube, I have a YouTube station, so feel free to check that out. I know that it's interesting to put that connection together between what your experiences are and think of them in sort of that new context, because I think there's much ado about nothing sometimes in the professional spheres. We see, very famous mediums like, the Long Island medium, for instance, and she's fantastic at what she does, but there's it's hard to correlate that she's not that different from you. So we'll be back at the other half of the show to talk about some more memories and more experiences and talk about the fact that you are psychic. Be right with you.
And now, back to your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Welcome back. This is Reverend Medium Tracey Lockwood. I'm guest host for Bernard today. If you did tune in late and you're interested in finding me, my website is mediumtracylockwood.com. You can find me on facebook.com psychic medium Tracey Lockwood, and my page is facebook.com medium Tracey Lockwood. So we were talking about different occurrences as I was a child. The next memory that I had in that sequence was that I had a really deep connection with cats, birds, dogs, ants. I seemed to be able to understand what it was they were thinking. I was able to see beyond things. You know, people seem to be like, sit, go, do this, you know, and it was more than just, oh, they're feeling sad or something. It's like I could understand them. And I had a very intuitive ability of working with animals. My favorite memory was of my brother bringing me a bird that had been knocked out of a tree. Some of his friends had taken a slingshot and knocked it out of the tree, and it was a little sparrow. It was so tiny, and it didn't even have any more than just bare pin feathers. It barely had those. It was just beginning to feather out. And he brought it, and I immediately assumed control because I considered myself the animal person in the household. And, you know, a lot of people talk about animal communication, and that can be done at many levels. But at this one, it was sort of an intuitive feeding, and my mom didn't think that the bird was going to make it because, you know, it was so young and you know, she didn't know, but I told her, mix some milk with some bread. Now, many of us know that you don't feed ducks or birds white bread because, you know, that's not good for them and it can stick. But for some reason, this little bird survived off of milk-soaked bread and worms that I would dig up. I'm sure I was not as good at digging worms as its mom would have been. And that bird continued to grow. And I used to sleep with it in my hand and hold it. And finally, we had to take a trip. We were going up to Wisconsin to visit my grandmother. And I took it with me, and we would stop on the road and dig worms and do our best to keep that little guy filled up. And his name was Cheer Up. And I don't know how I knew it was male. I just knew it was a male bird. And ultimately, Cheer Up did learn to fly. And one day my mom was in the backyard digging worms, and he went ahead and flew away. And I think that he came back. Like, I saw this one sparrow coming back, but he never returned to my hand. And I missed him greatly and hope that somewhere along the way the other birds taught him how to dig worms and survive in the wild. So there was an occurrence a little later on in high school where I had precognizance occur. Precognizance is where you know ahead of time what something is. And I was a really good student. I graduated 4th in my class from high school and really didn't find it very difficult to keep up with my studies, partly because I was in a school that didn't challenge it a lot. So it's pretty easy for me to keep on top of it. And I had this one day, though, that I had failed my geography exam. And I want to preface this with something that a friend of mine, a guy who had kind of a crush on me, Mike, we will not give his last name because I did not take up his affections, but he gave me a gerbil. He had given me a gerbil. He had brought it to school. It was like a baby gerbil, and he had brought it to school, and I had it in his pocket and gave it to me during school, and I took it home and had raised it for the last year or so. And I used to and I named him Friday because he was given to me on Friday. And I used to let him play in my dollhouse, and I used to set up furniture and set like a little banquet table with grains and things on a plate for him. And I just loved my gerbil Friday. But this day after my test, I was riding the bus home, and I had this thought, this psychic thought, precognitive thought. I thought, of course, I didn't label it that. I thought, oh, great. I failed my exam in geography, which I did, which is funny because I majored in geography later, and my gerbil's dead. Now, Friday had been fine. There was no reason to worry about him. But sure enough, when I walked in, Friday was all on his back with his little paws curled up and had left this world. And so I wondered, how did I know that? And I knew that because we have psychic abilities, and it was the kindness of the universe letting me know, preparing me for the possibility. It would have been a tremendous shock if I had just come in and found him. So I considered it a kindness that I knew ahead of time that had happened. So we feel, we sense, we know. I always had this sense that I had these beings around me. I always knew that there were what I thought of as angels around me. And they had these three that would stand in particular, very tall beings of light that would stand sort of from my right shoulder to center front. There were three of them that just filled that space. And there's a purpose for that I hope I get to on this show, just telling you where they were standing. But I also sensed that there were others around me, but I'm not sure that I recall meeting and talking to my guides per se when I was younger. I knew they were there. I just never thought to look, and I sort of threw them in the general category of angels. But I want to differentiate for you that angels are different than guides. And angels protect our life contract, our high soul will, and guides protect our material will and also our high soul will, of course, but they're here to help us through the material realm. And people that pass that we love actually don't become our guides or angels. They are just our ancestors or our loved ones. They are spirits. They can function as a facilitator and help us with this lifetime. They can look over us, etc. But their abilities, because they're connected in our soul group, are generally not at the level of a guide, even if they're a high soul themselves. And so I differentiate our facilitators, which are spirits that we knew or that were in previous generations, our ancestors, from angels and guides. And of course, we have other things too. We have totem animals that are around us. We have elemental energies that are around us. We have star seeds and star people around us, mythical creatures. And I always find it curious when I'm teaching a workshop and we are working on seeing things in the aura. You know, people think, oh, I can't see auras, but we can. And so far, no one has not been able to in the workshops because it's just a matter of focusing at a different level. And it's sort of a diffuse focus, looking over the shoulder of the person rather than trying to see it with your eyes. It's more of a sensing than a seeing. It's more of a knowing or feeling of a color rather than a seeing. And then it can become very visual, like a memory, as you absorb that information. But one of the things that we do is we look at the mythical creatures that are around people, and people don't really think like, oh no, that's just, you know, they didn't exist. There are no such things as dragons and unicorns. That's just mythology. But those pictures and ideas came from somewhere. And what's very fascinating to me is that in a small group, maybe I have 8 or 12 students working together, maybe 5 of them will pick up the same mythical creature in the same place. And they don't do it like, oh, I see a unicorn. And the next person says, oh, I see a unicorn too. It's like everybody draws pictures or writes down the names of what they see and where they see it on a little sketch of the person, and then they can color in things or write those words of what they see there. So anyway, it's amazing because there's an overlap. Many people will say, yeah, I saw a mermaid under there. It was kind of blue and green. And someone will go, oh my God, I saw a mermaid too. It's really exciting when you realize that you're actually seeing something that not you wouldn't think that you would see. It's just really fascinating. But one of the angels that I saw when I was probably a teenager was my recording angel. And I had been sound asleep and I woke up because I felt like somebody was really close to my face, like their face was near my face. And I opened my eyes and there was this little man, and he had like a goatee. He was in colors of gray. He wasn't like Technicolor, and I dream in color, so that was unusual that I was seeing him in those colors of sort of silver and gray, more gray, actually, like a gray and white image. And he was right in front of me, 3D, in my face. And as I looked at him, his face started to recede. And he was sitting with his legs crossed with this huge book, and he was just staring at everything. And he was writing with this pen that was like a feather pen, everything. And I felt like he was literally like recording, like, this is before I knew anything about, biblical thought on it, even, recording every hair and every breath, and somehow more than that. I maybe even my dreams, I don't know. But he was furiously writing, and it was a huge book. It was about, I don't know, I can't say what breakup it was in the writing, but I knew for sure that he was my recording angel, and I had a sense of recognition, but I didn't know how I could have recognized him, So that was an angel sighting that I had. And that would be clairvoyance, because I'm sure if my mom or dad had walked in the room, they wouldn't have seen him, So clairvoyant experience. And the first message that I actually got from another medium, I didn't even know that that's what she was. I had gone to Virginia Tech. I was studying pre-veterinary medicine because I liked animals better than people at that time. Now I think I love all, but at the time I was definitely preferring the animals, and thought that I wanted to work with them. So I went home with a friend of mine, Karen. She and I met the first year that I went there, and we were waiting around for one of her friends to join us. There were, there was Erlene and Stella and Karen, and so we Shelby and Karen. I knew that wasn't right. Shelby, Erlene, and Karen, and we were in the kitchen waiting for her friend to show up, and the mom was there, and she fed us some cookies and milk, and then as she was sitting there just calm and cool as a cucumber, and we were about 19, so we didn't really have a story of life written on our faces at that time, and she points to Karen and tells her some stuff. She tells Shelby, "You're going to have twins." And Shelby was a virgin, like Karen was a virgin, like we were all virgins, okay? Pretty much. Well, I might not have been, but that's a story for another day for you. But but they were, and so they hadn't even thought about boyfriends or anything like that. Neither had I, for that matter, as far as anything serious. I had never thought about getting married. So she told Shelby that she was going to have twins. She told Erlene, "You will never have children." And she told me that I would have 3 husbands, which nearly floored me since, like I said, I hadn't planned on the first one. And then I would meet my soulmate, and that I would have 3 children, and I would have trouble in childbearing, etc. And, everything she said came true. And I used to, through the years, wish so badly that I could talk to her, because it was really amazing, how I didn't understand. How could she know that? How could she know that? And Shelby had twins, and Arlene went into the Army. We found out later, and probably Arlene found out later because those were the days before an awareness of sexuality, that Arlene was gay. And Karen had her things come to pass, and I've had my 3 children and 3 husbands, and still waiting on that soulmate. But rumor has it is coming soon into my life. But that was the first time that I met someone who was psychic and had that sense of prophecy about the future. And I found it so interesting and had no realization that I was able to do that too. A couple of years later, I had to leave Virginia Tech, and I didn't want to stay where I was. I had fallen in love and received a warning from Spirit about the person that I was with, and left. And I moved to Odessa, Texas, and I was going to a Pentecostal church there. And I did everything that I do now, but under those other names, tongues and interpretation of tongues. And I was given prophetic things. There was a woman there that I prayed for, and she was instantly healed of cancer, and that kind of thing. But this one friend of mine, Debbie, she was one of my dear friends in the church. She had a beautiful voice, excellent singing voice, and she had a couple of kids and was really struggling financially. And I was over at her house. She was like the queen of potatoes. She could make potatoes like 12 ways. It was like amazing, just deliciousness wherever she turned. And she was feeding her family on them because that's what they had to do. And I had told her some things about her husband. I had warned her that I felt that he was involved in drugs. I don't remember the whole story, but I know I had advised her for the sake of the children to leave, and that in a certain number of months, this, and this. But I don't remember exactly everything. And the reason you don't remember things when you're working in the psychic realm is that you're in your right brain, you're in your subconscious. You're not always attached to your left brain, which understands and remembers and is critical. So you have to let go of that in order to do good readings. But I didn't think I was reading. I was just talking to her. And she stopped talking to me for almost a year. And about a year later, she came back and she said, "I'm so sorry." And I said, "For what?" And she said, "Well, I haven't been talking to you." And I said, "Yes, I know." And she said, "But it was because you told me some things and I didn't want to believe them. But everything happened exactly the way that you said. And I'm sorry. Can we be friends again?" I was like, "For sure." And we were. And that was wonderful. But I guess what I want to say is that, we have all these experiences that happen, but we label them differently. I think we all love to pigeonhole and put things in boxes and tidy them up and, make it one way or another. But our encounters show us a taste of what's possible if we choose to develop our gift, and they're here to help us in a practical way to navigate our lives. I heard a thing recently on Esther Hicks and Abraham, her channeled collective consciousness that Esther Hicks, the medium, channels, and they were talking about the emotional guidance system and how when we want to create something, we set that idea out there and then we kind of let go, and then our emotions are what guides us that direction by, does this feel right or not right? And in the Quran, it talks about follow the intuition of your God, like listen to that intuition. And as I said, gifts are not limited to one religion or another. They are for everybody. And I'm sure that you have a wide variety yourself, some that you might be aware of and some that you haven't tested yet. Another thing is that we're not alone. We have that thing about we're born alone or we die alone. But it's really not true, because we come in here with a whole entourage of angels and guides and ancestors and support from the other world to help us through this life. It's a wonderful world. This is the realm of miracles. This is the place where thoughts become things, and we're so much more than we imagine. And I really encourage you to develop your gift. I offer intuitive, psychic, and mediumship development via Skype. I train people from all over the world. There isn't a curriculum when we do that. It takes you from where you are and shows you what you can do rather than what you can't do. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Just Bernard Show. I know that you'll be happy to have Bernard back with you next week, but it's been a pleasure to be with you today. If you would like to reach me, again, it's at mediumtracylockwood.com, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. And I'd like to leave you with a thought that it's never inappropriate to be kind, and without integrity, you have nothing.